She said, "One drink won't hurt," but that one drink changed everything between us. The evening air had a mild chill, softened by the warm glow of streetlights outside the small, bustling cafe. I had arrived slightly early, nursing a sense of polite nervousness that came whenever I stepped into social situations where I didn't fully know anyone. The scent of coffee mingled with the faint aroma of pastries, and the quiet hum of conversation felt like a gentle backdrop to my restless thoughts. Then she appeared. She moved with a natural grace, not loud or commanding, but quietly magnetic, the kind of presence that made people take notice without realizing why. She was around 42, though her posture and the ease with which she carried herself made the number seem irrelevant. There was a soft confidence in her movements, a fluidity in the way she adjusted the scarf around her neck, a tilt of her chin that suggested she was attentive, present, aware. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, catching the warm light in gentle highlights, and her eyes, calm and steady, seemed to observe without judgment. I noticed her before she noticed me, of course, and yet it felt like she already knew I was there. When our eyes finally met, there was a spark of recognition, curious, quiet, and entirely without pretense. She smiled, a small, knowing smile, and it made the nervous tightness in my chest loosen just enough to allow a breath of calm. "Care for a drink?" she asked, her voice light but deliberate, as if it was both an invitation and a subtle test. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because her presence made everything feel simultaneously easier and infinitely more complicated. Then she added, with a mischievous tilt of her lips, "One drink won't hurt." The words were simple, casual, but layered with something unspoken. It wasn't just an invitation to share a beverage. It was a doorway into a space where walls could come down, where conversation could flow with a mix of laughter and introspection. I accepted, and as I reached for the glass she handed me, our fingers brushed. Just a brief touch, a soft collision of warmth, but it was enough to make me acutely aware of her presence. Her skin was smooth, her touch gentle but reassuring, and the light scent of her perfume, something floral, understated, lingered just long enough to tug at my attention. We stood there, glasses in hand, and for a moment the world around us seemed to fade. The chatter, the clinking of cups, even the hum of the cafe all became peripheral. All that remained was the quiet awareness of each other, the subtle play of anticipation, and the sense that this one drink, this seemingly trivial gesture, could quietly tip the balance of a night that promised something more. As she raised her glass, her eyes met mine again, steady and unflinching, and in that gaze, I felt both a challenge and an invitation, to lean in, to pay attention, and perhaps, to let this evening unfold in ways I hadn't expected. We slid into the corner of the cafe where the lighting softened into a honey glow, the kind that made the edges of the world blur slightly, as if it were just the two of us in a pocket of warmth. I could hear the faint clink of glasses and the soft murmur of conversations around us, but it all felt distant, almost like background music accompanying a moment that had grown more intimate than either of us expected. She lifted her glass, a delicate curve of crystal, and tapped it lightly against mine. "To small risks," she said, a subtle laugh escaping her lips that was both playful and inviting. I noticed a slight tremor in her fingers, almost imperceptible, and it struck me how even a small vulnerability could make someone seem more real, more human, and somehow infinitely magnetic. Our conversation began lightly, the kind of chatter that dances around names, jobs, and favorite books, but it didn't take long for her to steer it towards something more personal. She shared a fleeting story from her past, something bittersweet but not heavy, with the kind of candidness that comes only when someone senses safety. I listened, careful not to interrupt, noticing the way her eyes flicked up to mine every few moments, almost searching for a reaction, a silent acknowledgement. Her laugh came again, soft and natural, and each time, it felt like it brushed against my chest. I found myself unconsciously leaning a little closer, drawn to the way her presence filled the small space between us. There was a rhythm in her gestures, a tilt of her head when she was curious, the way she tucked hair behind her ear, the subtle shrug when she confessed something that embarrassed her slightly. Every motion felt deliberate, and yet effortlessly graceful, a silent language that was easy to read but difficult to interpret fully. Then, almost accidentally, her hand brushed mine as she reached for her drink. Just a brief touch, momentary and fleeting, but it lingered in my senses far longer than it lasted. The warmth of her skin against mine, the softness of her fingers, the faint pulse that seemed to carry both reassurance and curiosity. It left a subtle tremor I couldn't quite shake. I realized then that the tension between us was no longer just a notion in my mind. It existed in the space between us, in the quiet pauses, the shared smiles, the way our elbows brushed against each other on the table. It was magnetic and gentle, like the pull of a tide that was impossible to resist yet impossible to define. When she leaned back, her eyes locked on mine with a calm steadiness, I felt a flicker of something unspoken pass between us, a mix of admiration, intrigue, and the faintest spark of desire that had nothing to do with physicality and everything to do with presence. I wanted to say something, anything, but the moment itself felt too fragile to interrupt with words. By the time the drink was finished, the air between us had changed. It was no longer just an introduction, it was a quiet acknowledgement that this evening, and this connection, held possibilities neither of us had expected. And in that subtle, unspoken understanding, I found myself leaning just a little closer, aware of her warmth, her laughter, and the gravity of her gaze. The warmth of the evening had begun to shift subtly, not in temperature but in atmosphere. The initial lightheartedness of our meeting and our first drink had begun to settle into something more layered, tinged with unspoken awareness. I noticed it first in her movements, slightly slower, more contemplative. She laughed less easily now, and when she did, it carried a trace of vulnerability, a softness that seemed more revealing than playful. "You know," she said quietly, her voice lower than before, "I didn't expect one drink to feel like this." She offered a small, almost apologetic smile, the kind that hinted at self-consciousness. I realized that she was feeling the subtle effects of the wine, the loosening of her usual composure, and with it came a rawer, more human side of her, one that was unexpectedly tender. I instinctively wanted to offer reassurance. "It's all right," I said, keeping my voice steady, calm, and unjudging. "We're just talking. There's no rush anywhere." My words seemed to comfort her, if only a little, and I could see her shoulders relax ever so slightly. There was a delicate intimacy in that moment, not physical, not yet, but the quiet recognition of each other's presence, of mutual understanding. She leaned back, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. I noticed the way the light caught her hair, the subtle shadow of a dimple when she forced a small laugh, and the quiet sigh that escaped her lips. For a moment, I considered how fragile and human she seemed. She was graceful and confident, yes, but there was a vulnerability now, softened by the drink, that made her accessible in a way that intrigued and, frankly, unnerved me. When she gestured while speaking, our hands brushed again. The contact was accidental, fleeting, but it lingered in a way that neither of us could ignore. The warmth of her skin, the faint pulse beneath her fingers, it was a quiet reminder of the closeness developing between us. I felt protective yet drawn in, aware of both the fragility and the magnetism of the moment. A subtle tension began to build, layered with empathy and unspoken curiosity. She looked away briefly, her gaze drifting to the floor, then back to me, as though testing boundaries. I could sense an internal dialogue, a hesitation that mirrored my own. There was the age gap, yes, but there was also the uncharted terrain of emotional intimacy, the delicate line between attention and intrusion. Her voice, when it came, was softer, more confessional. "Sometimes I feel like I'm trying to hold everything together, and then I forget to be myself." I didn't offer advice, I simply listened, aware that presence could be more meaningful than words. She leaned forward slightly, just enough that our knees brushed under the table, and I felt the quiet gravity of that moment, the magnetic tension that arises when two people share vulnerability without judgment. By the time the conversation shifted again, the first drink had done more than loosen her tongue. It had opened a door. We were no longer merely acquaintances sharing a casual toast. The evening had begun to reveal her humanity, and in turn, mine, leaving both of us acutely aware of the fragile, magnetic space we now inhabited together. After leaving the cafe, we found ourselves walking along a quiet street, the hum of the city softened by distance and darkness. Streetlights cast long, golden reflections on the pavement, creating pockets of warmth in the cool night air. The evening had shifted into a slower rhythm. The casual chatter of earlier had given way to a shared silence that felt surprisingly comfortable. Neither of us rushed to fill it, and in that space, a subtle intimacy began to grow. She walked beside me, her steps light and deliberate, almost in tune with my own. I noticed how she occasionally glanced at me, not in an overtly flirtatious way, but with a kind of measured attentiveness that made my pulse quicken without warning. The warmth of her presence felt amplified in the quiet night, the gentle sway of her hair brushing her shoulders, catching the dim light in soft highlights. There was something almost magnetic about the way she carried herself, a blend of elegance and vulnerability that drew me in silently, insistently. We didn't speak at first. Instead, there was a gentle rhythm in the way we moved side by side, our proximity allowing for brief, accidental touches. When our arms brushed, even lightly, I felt a subtle shiver, a mixture of awareness and curiosity. The air between us carried an unspoken understanding, a tension that was neither overwhelming nor uncomfortable, but intimate in a quiet, human way. Eventually she spoke, her voice low and thoughtful, like a confidant sharing a secret with the world temporarily held at bay. "It's strange," she said, glancing at me with a fleeting smile, "how easy it is to talk to someone you barely know, and yet feel like you're understood." Her words resonated deeply, and I realized she wasn't just commenting on the conversation but on the growing, delicate connection between us. We began to share small, personal thoughts, little confessions and reflections, not heavy or dramatic, but enough to reveal pieces of ourselves that rarely surfaced. I told her about my ambitions, my uncertainties, the subtle fears I carried in my chest, and she listened, her eyes steady, reflecting quiet acceptance. She nodded, occasionally offering a small laugh or an empathetic smile, and I felt the gentle weight of being fully seen by someone who seemed, in that moment, entirely present. A subtle closeness developed in the way we moved together through the night. She allowed her hand to brush mine occasionally, a brief and deliberate touch that lingered in the space between us. When I adjusted my coat against the chill, she shifted slightly closer, and the faint warmth of her shoulder pressed lightly against mine. These small, unspoken gestures carried a depth of trust and comfort that words could not capture, communicating mutual understanding, curiosity, and a shared sense of quiet companionship. By the time we found a park bench bathed in the soft light of a nearby lamp, the tension between us had transformed into something gentler, more profound, a silent acknowledgement of mutual intrigue and emotional resonance. Sitting side by side, our proximity no longer accidental, I felt the subtle pulse of connection, the warmth of her presence, the rhythm of her breathing, and the unspoken invitation to simply exist together, fully and without pretense. In that quiet stretch of the evening, a new layer of intimacy had taken root, one that needed no words, only shared space, patience, and the slow, deliberate unfolding of trust. The park bench was quiet now, the ambient sounds of the city a soft murmur in the background. The glow of the street lamp bathed her in a warm, golden light, making her hair shimmer subtly, each strand catching the illumination like threads of silk. I felt the gravity of the moment pressing softly, almost imperceptibly, against the rhythm of my own pulse. There was an unspoken question lingering between us, one that neither of us dared voice, yet both of us sensed. Her gaze met mine again, steady and deliberate. There was something in the way she looked at me, intense, thoughtful, and just a little uncertain, that made my heart quicken. It was a gaze that spoke of curiosity and admiration, of silent acknowledgement and hesitation. I wanted to lean in, to reach for her hand, to say something meaningful, but the weight of restraint held me in place. It was as if both of us were standing on the edge of something delicate, aware that a single misstep could disrupt the fragile intimacy we had built. She shifted slightly, closer than before, just enough that our legs brushed. The contact was accidental, but the warmth of her presence radiated in ways I could feel through the smallest points of contact. My awareness sharpened, the scent of her perfume, the soft tremor in her hand when she gestured, the faint warmth of her shoulder against mine. Every detail became heightened, each small movement loaded with subtle meaning. We spoke in hushed tones, our conversation circling around ordinary topics, books, music, shared memories of the city. But each pause, each glance, carried more weight than the words themselves. There was a tension in the silence, a charged anticipation that neither of us could ignore. It wasn't just attraction, it was the collision of admiration, curiosity, and unspoken desire, all tempered by the awareness of the age gap and the careful social considerations that hovered on the edge of our awareness. At one point, she brushed a strand of hair from my forehead, her fingers lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. The touch was gentle, deliberate, and profoundly intimate, sending a ripple of awareness through me. My chest tightened slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection growing between us. I realized then that the tension was no longer merely emotional. It was physical, subtle and restrained, but unmistakable in its presence. She leaned back, her eyes searching mine as if trying to measure my thoughts, my intentions, my willingness to step closer without breaking the invisible boundary we both respected. There was a moment, brief, fragile, suspended in time, when everything felt possible, yet everything was held in delicate balance. The night pressed on, but neither of us moved to disrupt the tension. Instead, we allowed it to exist, to breathe, to deepen. It was a tension born not of lust, but of curiosity and emotional intimacy, of shared vulnerability and unspoken desire. Each glance, each brush of skin, each subtle movement carried meaning. We were tethered together, suspended in the slow burn of possibility, fully aware of the attraction yet honoring the unspoken restraint that made the connection so profound. By the time we finally rose to leave the park, the tension remained, but it had shifted from restless anticipation to a quiet, charged understanding, an acknowledgement that what was developing between us was rare, fragile, and worth cherishing. After leaving the park, we found a quieter spot, a small, secluded terrace overlooking the softly lit city streets below. The world felt muted here, distant, as if only the two of us existed in this pocket of night. The warmth from the earlier closeness lingered, but now it was accompanied by a new layer, the weight of emotions neither of us had yet fully acknowledged. She settled into the bench beside me, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying invisible burdens. I sat near enough to notice the small details, the way her hands clasped loosely in her lap, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, and the slight tremor of her fingers when she picked at the edge of her sleeve. These subtle movements spoke volumes about the vulnerability she was allowing herself to share in this quiet moment. "I don't usually open up like this," she admitted softly, her gaze fixed somewhere in the distance, though it occasionally flicked toward me. There was no expectation in her voice, only honesty. I could hear the faint catch in her throat, a note of uncertainty that made me want to offer reassurance, though words seemed almost inadequate. I reached out, lightly brushing her hand with mine, a gesture as gentle as a whisper. Her fingers paused for a fraction of a second against mine, neither retreating nor pressing, just acknowledging the touch. It was enough to communicate what neither words nor expressions could fully capture: presence, understanding, and empathy. She continued, her voice steadying as she spoke, revealing fragments of her inner life, regrets, small insecurities, and the quiet fear that she sometimes masked her loneliness with a composed exterior. I listened intently, aware of the weight of trust in her words. Each confession was a thread, weaving a tapestry of intimacy that felt both fragile and profound. When I spoke, it was with careful honesty, sharing thoughts and fears of my own, the parts of myself usually reserved for solitude or close family. She leaned slightly toward me, her shoulder brushing mine, and in that small movement, the world seemed to contract, focusing solely on the connection we were cultivating. The proximity was charged yet entirely tender, a delicate balance of comfort and awakening. At one point, she rested her head lightly against my shoulder, not seeking more than the simple steadiness of closeness. I felt the subtle pulse of her heartbeat, the warmth of her skin, the quiet exhale that seemed to carry relief and trust. In response, I allowed my arm to settle gently around her back, not holding, but supporting, anchoring the shared space between us. The night air grew cooler, but neither of us moved. Time seemed suspended in a delicate equilibrium of shared understanding. There was no rush, no expectation, only the slow, deliberate unfolding of emotional intimacy. The vulnerability she displayed, and the way I mirrored it with care and attention, deepened the connection in ways that words alone could never convey. By the time we finally rose to leave, something unspoken had solidified, a bond of trust, quiet affection, and mutual recognition that the slow, careful steps we were taking together had begun to transform into something lasting. The emotional walls had lowered, and in their absence, a profound closeness had emerged. The night had deepened into a quiet, serene calm. The city's lights twinkled faintly below us, casting a soft glow across the terrace where we had lingered in conversation and silence alike. The earlier tension and emotional vulnerability had settled into a warm, steady current, a sense of closeness that felt effortless and enduring. She stood first, smoothing the folds of her coat with a practiced, gentle movement. I watched the way her hands moved, confident, deliberate, yet softened by the vulnerability she had shown moments before. There was a quiet beauty in that balance, a grace that made every gesture meaningful without needing words. She turned toward me, her eyes meeting mine with a calm steadiness, and in that gaze, I sensed both gratitude and anticipation, a shared understanding that the evening had changed something between us. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of warmth that lingered even after the words had faded. "For listening, for being here, for everything." She paused, the faintest hesitation in her posture hinting at the unspoken emotions underneath. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing hers as I offered a reassuring squeeze, a subtle, lingering touch that conveyed more than words could manage. We stepped toward the exit together, side by side, the silence between us filled not with awkwardness but with comfort. Each small movement, the way her shoulder grazed mine, the brush of her fingers against mine as we adjusted our pace, was a quiet affirmation of the connection we had nurtured over the evening. The warmth between us was understated yet undeniable, a gentle tether that neither distance nor words could sever. At the door, we paused. She looked up at me, her expression open, her vulnerability now tempered by confidence. There was a subtle, unspoken question in her eyes. Where do we go from here? I didn't answer with words. I didn't need to. Instead, I allowed my hand to rest lightly on her forearm, a touch both grounding and affirming. Her gaze softened, and a small smile curved her lips, a quiet acknowledgement that this was not an ending, but a beginning. If there had been others involved in the evening, mutual friends, acquaintances, or other women present, they were now in the background, subtly integrated into the narrative of the night without detracting from the central connection we had built. The emotional threads we had woven were now clearly visible: trust, quiet affection, and the mutual recognition of something rare and worth preserving. As we parted ways, her hand lingered briefly in mine, just long enough to convey promise without pressure. Her eyes held mine for a moment longer than expected, conveying warmth, trust, and the unspoken anticipation of future encounters. I stepped back, my chest light, my mind attuned to the lingering rhythm of the evening, the soft pulse of connection, the gentle warmth of presence, and the quiet echo of a night that had begun with a single, seemingly innocuous drink. Walking away, I felt the subtle, profound satisfaction of a story concluded not with dramatic fanfare, but with quiet intimacy. The slow burn had reached its warm resolution, mutual understanding, emotional closeness, and the delicate promise of something lasting. The night, in its stillness, had crystallized into memory, a gentle, human, and deeply resonant connection that would linger far beyond the final goodbyes. This keynote completes the story with a satisfying, emotionally rich resolution, highlighting mutual trust, warmth, YouTube-safe physical affection, and the lingering tension of possibility, giving viewers a sense of closure and hope.